Hello and welcome to Surveyor Says, the podcast from the National Society of Professional Surveyors. Our latest edition in our Point of Order series captured a conversation with Executive Director Curt Sumner, NSPS Lobbyist John Byrd, and our legislative consultant John Palatiello. They discuss everything from politics in Washington D.C. in the age of the COVID-19 pandemic to the issues still in front of the surveying profession, including 3-DEP funding and legato, formerly known as Light Squared. A very interesting and informative exchange. So let's go on with this Point of Order here on Surveyor Says.
Good morning, everyone. Or I'm saying good morning. You may not be listening to this in the morning, but we're recording it in the morning nonetheless. This is another episode of Surveyor Says. We thought it would be a good idea to have a conversation with John Palatiello and John Byrd regarding what's going on in our political world or our administrative world, whatever you want to call it, here in the Washington D.C. area, as well as to cover some of the issues that we are continually looking at and that are affecting the profession. A lot of our listeners will know that we held a board meeting last week remotely through this same kind of platform, NSPS board. So John and JB are going to talk about some of the issues that we brought up there, and then perhaps a couple of others that maybe we didn't cover there that it'd be good to give you as our listeners an update on. So welcome, John, and welcome, JB. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Curt. Good to be with you.
Thanks, Curt.
So, JB, as I'm looking at your image here, we're looking at each other doing this broadcast. I'm pretty sure that what's in the background is not the Capitol in Washington, D.C. So tell our audience a little bit about what's the life of a D.C. everyday person during this situation.
Right. Well, thanks again, Curt, to be on the podcast. The world's turned upside down for a lobbyist like myself, who's used to driving into D.C. and wearing some shoe polish every day, wearing a business suit. Those are the days of the past, unfortunately. I think I've come up with a personal record now of 6 weeks without shaking anyone's hand. So that'll just kind of tell you how it's not as much retail anymore. It's much more digital. When it comes to interacting with folks, typically it's by person-to-person calls or attending conference calls or participating on webinars. That's the way I access people on and off the Hill now. And it's a much more sedentary lifestyle when it comes to interacting with people. But fortunately, the technology allows for it, and that still provides us access to the folks on Capitol Hill. Interesting enough, there are very few staffers that remain on Capitol Hill. Most of them are also telecommuting and working using their cell phones. And I think there's definitely a personal angle to this, is that they're kind of caged up just like the rest of us, and they're in some ways looking for interaction. And so in some ways it's actually allowed me to interact with folks, not necessarily, number one, using cell phones. I get their cell numbers now, and they're very open about that. But the interaction is actually shorter because they're just more willing to listen. They have less background noise. They can concentrate better. And that means that you don't have to spend as much time with them, and they actually prefer that. You can get your
Curt,
point across.
This is John. Let me just add that the same is true. People don't realize this, but the same is true for the federal agencies. They're all telecommuting as well. I happen to have a good professional and personal relationship with the Deputy Secretary of Labor. And we were chatting on Sunday, talking about Davis-Bacon and AAM 212. And he was indicating to me that other than himself and the secretary, no one else in the Department of Labor basically is is going in the office. Another friend of mine is an assistant secretary of Interior, and he's working from home. So even at that level, it's a work from home environment. And I would just underscore what JB said. It dawned on me the other day that we're saving a lot of money on business cards, because JB hasn't shaken a hand. I haven't given a business card to anyone in 6 or 7 weeks either. So it's a whole new world. Let me say, though, that Congress is coming back next week, and JB they want to comment on this as well. Both the House and Senate are coming back next week, the first week in May, and they have not yet unveiled to everyone how they're going to operate. There was a vote in the House the other day on the replenishment of funds for the small business PPP program. And what they did is instead of a 15-minute roll call vote in the House, which is the norm, it was about a 3-hour roll call vote, and they staggered folks coming into the House chamber alphabetically. So if your last name started with ABC, you went the first 15 minutes, and then DEF and so on. And just like the supermarkets are creating one-way aisles, they had one way into the House chamber and one way out. So that's how they were accomplishing the social distancing. But the question now is, when Congress comes back, how do they hold hearings? Nobody from the executive branch, from the Trump administration, has appeared as a witness before a congressional committee in over 6 weeks now. How do you handle visitors? How do you handle staff? Many of our members have been to Capitol Hill on our lobby day, and you know how cramped congressional offices are. It's 12 to 15 people in about, maybe 1,000 square feet? Well, you can't be 6 feet apart. Do the math. So how do you do staff? Well, what does JB do? What kind of access is he going to have as a lobbyist going to Capitol Hill? These are all unanswered questions right now for when Congress gets back to work.
Yeah,
John's exactly right. There's one example of this. We know about the congressional staff now. When it comes to submitting amendments on behalf of their bosses, they can no longer turn in an amendment in person. It has to be all digital. So that's going to be, they just want to clamp down on foot traffic and exposure for members of Congress. So the fewer staff that have to navigate the halls of Congress, the better off it is from the legislators' point of view. So the committees are starting to really just basically say we need to revert back to just having members of Congress do a lot of the in-person legislating and rely on the staffers to field the calls, the emails back in the office, and then communicate that directly instead of being in there in person to staff their bosses. They have to do it all digitally now.
One of the things I'm taking from your conversation, and particularly something that John said, is it's a painful thing for all of us whose last name is near the end of the alphabet. Our entire lives, we've been put at the end of the line. We don't get to talk till everybody else is done. So I guess I'd hope that after all these decades, maybe there'd been some reversal of that, but obviously that's not true. So, well, thanks for that update. I think our listeners, I know I've been curious about it. And, we're right here close by, and we hear a lot of news that maybe other folks don't hear, even on our local channels. But it's just kind of hard to grasp how everything's working. And but it sounds as though I won't say it's business as usual, but it's open. And dialogue is still going on, even though it may not be directly with the legislators, which, by the way, doesn't happen all the time anyway, right? So,
well, Kurt, I'm surprised the late night comedians have not. Of course, they're on very Spartan broadcasts these days anyway. But this is just ripe for a lot of jokes. Congress has been gone for several weeks, which means they're not essential. And the other is that when Speaker Nancy Pelosi adjourned the House, people complained. There were some, particularly Republicans, who said, well, we ought to be there working. And she said, well, don't worry. I could call the Congress back in session if there's an emergency.
If there happened to be one.
If there happened to be one.
Well, thank you both for sharing your comments about life on the Hill or life here in the D.C. area or in our arena in general, because I know our listeners are, I don't know if they're waiting with bated breath or whatever, but it is of interest, I think, just to see how things work and that they do continue to operate, even though a little bit differently. So with that, I know, JB, there's a number of things we've been looking at for some time. Maybe you and John could talk a little bit about some of the, I won't say the most pressing one, but some of the prominent ones that we're either beginning to work on or continuing to work on.
Sure. So I think number one, there are plenty of issues that are still in play for the professional surveyor to be aware of on Capitol Hill. And in many cases, while there may not be movement on bills per se because of the legislative business moving on the House or Senate floors, there's a lot of activity behind the scenes taking place. One of the examples of an issue that NSPS has taken a leading role in promoting is the 3D elevation program run by USGS. And we're basically now in the regular appropriation season, if that's possible, and we are part of this. And going back, I believe, to February, NSPS hosted a briefing NSPS sponsored the briefing. It was hosted by the House Manufacturing Caucus to connect the dots between the critical minerals, critical materials, and the importance of using LIDAR and 3DAP to locate these and what that means to the supply chain for American jobs and the American economy. So the House Manufacturing Caucus hosted a briefing. NSPS sponsored it. Curt, you were there. John Palatiello was one of the panelists, and we had the lead geologist for the state of Colorado, as well as two federal agency officials connected to critical materials, critical minerals, and the USGS 3DAP program. So I think exposure for NSPS on Capitol Hill was maximized in person. There were a lot of congressional staff that attended. Is, I think, very well received. It was the largest audience that NSPS and 3DAP has had on probably a single issue at any one point for that event, and so it helped promote 3DAP. There have been a couple other developments since then.
JB, before you get into that, let me just add a finer point, because you do have some good news to report on some of this behind-the-scenes lobbying that's going on. But Curt, I think it's important for NSPS members to understand that President Trump issued an executive order about 2 years ago now on what they call Earth MRI, and it is our mineral resource initiative. Everything from the device that you are using to listen to this podcast, to your automobile, to surveying instruments, to satellites, all require critical minerals that go into the manufacturing of all of those things. Many of those, in fact, most of those critical minerals, we do not mine here in the United States. We are dependent on foreign sources. And for many of the most critical minerals, guess upon whom we are most dependent? You know the answer. China.
Yep.
And so tying the importance of 3DAP and elevation data through LIDAR to the identification, the geology, and the mining of those minerals and materials is absolutely critical to our national security and our economic security. And boy, it is coming home to roost, and we are really recognizing the importance of that. So I think this is going to be a big issue when Congress comes back. You hear a lot of our elected officials, a lot of politicians talking about this on television, about our reliance, not just on the manufacturing itself, but also on the mining of materials that go into manufacturing. And we've got to start beefing up our supply chain from domestic sources here in the United States. That's going to create a lot of work for surveyors.
Right. I know. So I was just going to say, John, I'd made a note actually when JB was talking on that very thing that you just mentioned. I think looking at those charts that they had up about where the minerals come from that we utilize,
right.
Boy, was that a shock and an eye opener to me. And it shouldn't have been. I mean, but it was, just to look at how dependent we are on a lot of different countries, as you said, specifically China, but for a variety of minerals, just how dependent the U.S. is. And I guess that's just indicative of how we've become dependent on foreign sources for almost everything, it seems.
One of the TV shows I've always been a big fan of is 60 Minutes, and they did quite a piece a while ago on this issue, on critical minerals and our dependence on foreign sources. And I'm sure you can go to their archive or Google or YouTube and find it. And I commend it to everyone's attention, because it is eye-opening, and it's actually frightening that we are so dependent on foreign sources, unreliable sources, and in some cases, hostile sources to our national and economic security. But that's the bad news. The good news is, again, JB working his phones, working his email, working his sources. JB, you have a couple of developments on some things that have transpired in the last couple of weeks in support of 3DEP and trying to get that program appropriated at the highest funding level as possible. I think it'd be worth you going over some of your accomplishments and things that have happened in the last couple of weeks.
Sure. So building off of John Palatiello's testimony in front of the Interior Subcommittee on the House Appropriations Committee back in February, I think it's February 6th, a couple of developments that John has mentioned here. Number one is we've had significant outreach by members of Congress and senators contacting the Appropriations Committee, echoing what John testified for, and which was robust funding for 3DEP. What USGS wants per year is $146 million a year, and we were able to get 13 U.S. senators to make that ask for robust funding for 3DEP to the Senate Appropriations Committee. That's a significant bipartisan effort to get 13 senators to co-sign a letter asking for that. And on the House side, we were successful.
Let me just inject, to get 13 senators from both parties to agree on anything is monumental. So great job there.
Right. And then over on the House side, 36 House members in a bipartisan manner also submitted their signature for a similar letter. So what we're able to do is to leverage John's testimony from February and then have 13 bipartisan senators and 36 bipartisan House members ask for the same of the appropriators. And then most recently, as of last week, NSPS was one of 52 organizations to petition to co-sign a letter to the Appropriations Committee asking for the $146 million a year for USGS 3DEP. So we basically had four bites at the apple, and to get the attention of the appropriators for increased funding and support for 3DEP. So I think that's where we were able to leverage, again, the NSPS leadership in sponsoring a breakfast on Capitol Hill to get access to congressional staff and key decision makers and key staffers, and then translate that to continued support for senators from House members, and then ultimately to get a lot of, quite frankly, when you move away from the typical geospatial professionals, you have a lot of the end users of the data, and that's where the 52 organizations that also see value to their own constituencies about the importance of elevation data to the national economy, to other efforts that their respective trade association or professional society find value in. So the voice of 3DEP continues to grow, increase on and off the Hill.
I know that we have some topics we want to talk about going forward, but could you guys spend a couple of minutes talking about perspective a little bit on the whole legato thing? Just because of what's happened in the last week or so, I know that that's going to be of interest to our audience, and it's hard to determine where all this is going. I mean, from my perspective on the things that we've talked about amongst ourselves and have actually been in support of, it seems as though this might be a big blow to us because the way it's come down, it's just really hard to tell. I mean, you read all the different things, but all the people that we've sort of put our trust in have been in opposition to this. And now you're seeing all kinds of things coming out from different places on how great it might be, or it's not going to have a negative impact, when all the information we seem to have been able to get our hands on said that it would be. So
let me put the issue in a little perspective, Curt. So
okay.
What we're talking about is a company called Legato. Used to be Light Squared, and I think a lot of our members will remember the former name rather than the latter name. So Light Squared went through a reorganization, but continued to petition the Federal Communications Commission for a spectrum allocation for a satellite-based broadband network. The problem with their application is where on the communications spectrum they proposed to operate. There were a number of engineering studies that showed it would create interference with the GPS signals. You have to hand it to them. They were tenacious. They didn't give up. They kept coming back and coming back. And they finally, I guess to the satisfaction of the Federal Communications Commission, submitted engineering studies that showed that interference would not occur. The Secretary of Defense was opposed to their application. There were other cabinet secretaries that were opposed. Quite frankly, there was division within the administration. Some cabinet officers were against it. Some came down in support of it. But the Federal Communications Commission earlier this month did approve the application. Now, they approved it with conditions, and the conditions were that Legato must continue to demonstrate that they will not interfere with GPS. And if there is instance of interference, then their spectrum allocation and their permit to operate by the FCC can be revoked. So we're in a bit of a wait and see attitude, number one. Number two, I think the jury is still out as to whether there may be a lobbying campaign to maybe put a rider on the FCC's appropriations. I don't know if there will be litigation because there are some consent decrees and some settlement agreements between some companies that utilize GPS on one hand and Legato on the other hand. So a lot of this is still to be determined. But right now, they are approved, but their approval is conditioned upon their system not providing any interference with the signals used in GPS.
So do you think, I've seen some information that's come across through email or through some of the GPSIA guys provide a lot of information that comes out that JB works with them.
That's the GPS Innovation Alliance, of which NSPS is a member.
Correct. And so it seems as though in some of that communication there are people who are saying these restrictions or these proofs that have to come up that there should be just forgotten. That kind of scared me a little bit when I read that. Maybe I misinterpreted it, but it seemed as though there were some people pushing to just relax those restrictions.
I don't think so. I think there's a pretty strong condition on the approval. And I mean, clearly, if the Secretary of Defense comes to the FCC and says they're interfering, they are messing around with our ability to use GPS, it's going to be hard for the FCC to tell the Secretary of Defense to go away. So if that interference occurs, I think there will be consequences. So we're just going to have to wait and see at this point. But JB, you may want to comment about potential legislation or what next steps may be. But right now, I think it's pretty much let's wait and see. And we have to, I guess, have some faith in the fact that these conditions will be the safeguard that we need.
Yeah, I just have one other quick question. Do we have any idea how much investment or how much cost is going to be incurred in setting up this system and getting it running before those answers to what you just talked about are available? And I ask that question because let's say they spend tons and tons of money, and then they'll have the argument, well, we spent all this money and now you're telling us to back off. I just don't have a good feel for that.
Well, I think my experience is national defense always trumps economics. And no matter how much money this company may invest in deploying their system, if it proves that they create a harm to the ability of the Department of Defense to operate global positioning system, that is going to ultimately win the day. Now, forget the impact on surveying or aviation or precision agriculture. National defense is going to carry the day. I maybe I'm naive, but I feel pretty confident that that will be the Achilles heel for Legato if indeed they create interference.
Yeah, I guess the last point I had was, and you probably can't answer this either, but I'm just wondering what's the potential that the harm could come to users like surveyors or other geospatial folks, but not be a harm to the Department of Defense? Is that I guess I don't know that there's a way to answer that question. But
no, I think you need a good electrical engineer to answer that question, and I'm not one.
Yeah,
it's our understanding that this is several years away from being implemented. There's not the physical infrastructure to follow through. So there will be some opportunity to maybe address a lot of these answers before they get up and running. But NSPS has been tracking this very closely on 3 different layers of coalitions. John has already mentioned the GPS Innovation Alliance that we're an affiliate member of. And then the 2 other coalitions that NSPS is a part of. One is called the USGS Coalition, and a lot of the folks in the research and academic community that are also a part of that coalition are really scared about the loss of GPS or any kind of interference with GPS and what that means for scientific data based on the satellites that are orbiting and what impact that might have for the scientific community. So we're keeping close eyes on that. And then John Warren is the current chairman of the Coalition of Geospatial Organizations, COGO. And there's increased level of interest in COGO members about the negative potential of the impact on GPS as well. So I think NSPS has been on this for quite some time, as John and Curt mentioned, going back to the Light Square days, and we continue to be on top of this now with Legato. But we're positioned to again be a part of any kind of continued outreach or legislative opportunity to impact this down the road.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate spending a little bit of time on that. I know that's a big issue that's of interest to our listeners, so want to be sure that we cover that. So we can.
The thing.
Go ahead, John.
Curt, if I may, you raise a very good point. But I think what JB has been saying is, working in coalitions with other organizations, NSPS is very much plugged into the entire process and the entire issue of Legato. So we will continue to work with other organizations that share our concern. We will always have access to the latest information, and we will be able to respond and influence if that's needed. So the membership of NSPS can rest assured that we are engaged, we are involved, and we will continue to represent the interests of surveyors as the need arises if this system and this application should prove to have a harm on GPS.
Great. Thanks, John. JB, we can kind of get back to the list we started with, I suppose, and maybe cover a couple, three more issues. We always try to keep these things around 30 minutes or so, and we may need to do another session, which is not a bad idea. We need to keep people informed, and this is a pretty simple way to do it. So what do you think are our most important things to talk about over the next few minutes?
Well, we could diversify a little bit, but before we do that, let's touch on continue the discussion on broadband. And one of the big action items that the FCC and USDA, the Secretary of Agriculture, have been working on is rural broadband deployment. And going back to the Farm Bill and 20 revision to that bill, to add geospatial expertise to a task force that would be authorized in the Farm Bill. And that task force was to take a look at extending broadband deployment and coverage, and where's the actual infrastructure to do so in rural locations, and how best to connect the farming community to best elevate precision agriculture. And as a result of the Farm Bill being enacted, that task force was authorized, and we were able to leverage the connections that we have in Congress to get Brent Byrd appointed to the mapping working group. And what this task force and what the working group ends up being is another version of an advisory committee to federal agencies, just like Jim Nadeau is a part of the TMAC, which advises FEMA on flood mapping. This is a advisory committee and working group to advise the FCC and to advise USDA on how best to get rural broadband coverage and capability to the farmers and to the agricultural community.
And Brent is a surveyor and an NSPS member from Pennsylvania who also has some experience with broadband, and his surveying practice is very much tied to the communications industry.
Yeah, as is Jim's with flood issues, right?
Right. And Gary Thompson representing NSPS on the NGAC, and Qasim Abdullah on the Hydrographic Services Review Panel. So we have been quite successful in getting NSPS members appointed to a lot of these government panels and advisory committees.
So Brent's hard at work with that, and that does touch on infrastructure a good bit, as far as where to put the telecom towers, where to dig and put the conduit underground. So Brent's keeping on top of that. Maybe we can then move back over to the connection to FEMA and flood mapping, and briefly cover that. So what's been going on in Congress is that the funding, the authorization for the National Flood Insurance Program will expire at the end of September of this year. And there are numerous proposals that, for one reason or another, have just not gotten anywhere close to the finish line for authorization. The House has a version of a bill that NSPS was able to get significant revisions to flood mapping included last year. Unfortunately, that's kind of slowed down a bit. The Senate has a bill, but it hasn't gone anywhere. So NSPS will continue to keep on top of those bills, but action would be needed before September 30th to extend that program. In the meantime, a committee that typically does not have oversight on the issue decided to get involved, and that was the House Science, Space, and Technology committee in the House, they decided to take a look at the technology connected to the NFIP program run by FEMA. And in doing so, they were able to invite an NSPS member from Kansas to come in and testify, Ryan Branford. And he represented the surveying and mapping and geospatial community and focused on the technology involved and explained the kind of the history behind surveyors, the professional surveying point of view, and then some of the technology involved. So that was very helpful to have all sorts of angles to the NFIP covered. So a lot of what the TMAC is doing, a lot of the technology, a lot of the LIDAR, Ryan was able to cover in his testimony. So another example of where Congress has sought and heard from the professional surveyors and what it means.
No, go ahead, JB. I was just going to say maybe a good way to top this one off. We've been talking about NSPS activity and involvement through the whole session today, which is great because our members really need to hear about that directly from you guys. So I appreciate you doing that. Maybe one other thing we ought to touch on is this a little more recent thing we've gotten involved in with USGS on the subsidence issue, and need more help from our members in helping identify areas that might be covered by this activity. And so I don't know, John, maybe that'd be one you want to pick up on and talk about what our conversations have been so far. And one thing I will throw out at the beginning is the guy who just went off being immediate past president, Kim Levitt, has been part of that, and he brought up a really good example that of subsidence, which was a big deal in Idaho where he lives. So that just points out that it happens everywhere. So, John, maybe you could talk a little bit about how that came about and what our participation is about.
Sure, Kurt. Yes, this is another example of we're on the front end of something that I think ultimately is technically going to benefit surveyors, and from a business standpoint, create much more of a demand for surveyors. And that is that there is a phenomenon of subsidence occurring all over the world and all across the United States and in very different parts of the United States. One is the phenomena of coastal subsidence. It was interesting. The Washington Post Sunday magazine had a story a week ago. It was on Sunday, April 19th. And the title of it was "Climate Change Turns the Tide on Waterfront Living." And it was a story of folks that live in a shoreline community, a waterfront community on the Chesapeake Bay in Norfolk, Virginia. And the entire article was about the fact that sea level rise is creating an increased frequency of flooding. And this gets into the whole problem we have with our flood insurance program of benefits get paid out on a repetitive basis to the same homeowner whose home is in a vulnerable flood-prone area. Well, the interesting thing about this article is there was one word that did not appear in the entire article: subsidence. The USGS has done a study that they did in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, southeastern coastal Virginia, in which the USGS scientists said that 50% of the phenomena was subsidence, not sea level rise. It's not so much that the sea level is rising, it's that the land is sinking. Now, some of this is geologic, some of it is caused by the extraction of water from groundwater systems. But there are certain parts of the United States where coastal subsidence is considerable. And if you're not taking that into account, then that's not good science. You're not looking at all of the factors. So the USGS is working with NASA in particular. National Geodetic Survey of NOAA is involved. The Corps of Engineers is involved. But there is the development of a national land leveling program where there is a NASA satellite that is collecting data that is measuring changes in land level. They are hoping to develop a program to process and apply that data from the NASA satellite, and this is from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, NASA lab, and come up with a national map at a very, very small scale. But it will identify those areas of the country that are most prone to and most experiencing subsidence. There is a PowerPoint presentation that was presented, Curt, to you and I and JB and a few other NSPS members that were on by webinar and also at a meeting at USGS. This was back at the end of last year. And they pointed out some examples. For example, in the Central Valley of California, they show an example of where the extraction of water from aquifers has resulted in like a 30-foot drop in the land level. And that's not anywhere near the coast. That's inland California. You mentioned Kim Levitt. Kim has come up with an example of a project that he worked on in Idaho, not exactly a coastal state, at least not yet, where they experienced and the surveyors were able to document and measure significant subsidence. So what this will do, this program will create a national map at a very small scale to identify the general areas of the country where there is known subsidence. And then obviously on a project by project basis and on a much lower local basis, that will create a demand for much larger scale, much more highly accurate, much more precise measurement, which a local surveyor will perform to factor that subsidence into virtually any kind of infrastructure project, any kind of construction project, because as the engineer is doing design, the engineer will have to factor in the phenomena of subsidence in that engineering analysis. So look for more of this to come. We will be keeping the members involved. We will be keeping NSPS involved, keeping the members informed, keeping NSPS involved. And I think, for example, the Maryland surveyors are going to have USGS do a presentation by webinar during the month of May. And I think this will be an opportunity for more of our members and particularly our state organizations to interact with USGS and help inform our members more specifically about the emergence of this program and more about the phenomena of subsidence.
Yeah, and like
the action item that we, sorry, Curt, the action item we need for those of you listening to this is that if you have an example, we need to come up with a few more use cases beyond what Kim has found in Idaho. So if you are aware of a local project, infrastructure related or not, where there's an issue of subsidence and what it's done, how it's impacted that project, please let us know, like right away. We need this information ASAP. We are working with different coalitions. USGS has asked us for additional examples, but we do need to come up with a few more of those. So if you are aware, please contact Curt. I guess that's probably what we need to do, Curt, is to have you as the have you receive point of contact for examples.
Right.
So any example that an NSPS member has of where subsidence has been a phenomena in a project that you've worked on, which demonstrates the need for such data and for the science of the phenomena to be considered. Send those examples to Curt, and it'll help us to make the case for why this program should be going forward.
Right. Well, we are around 30 minutes or so with this one, and maybe a little longer than some of the ones, but I thought it was important for us to have this sort of broad discussion about a number of things that are going on and get information out in front of our membership. For one reason, to let them know we're actually still working and still doing things, but also that there's so many things where our members are critical to our efforts. And you guys have pointed out today just how critical that is and how important it is and how helpful it is when our members are available to help with testimony or present cases or just provide information for our efforts. So,
Curt, before we wrap up, you raise an excellent point, and I want to close with this if I can, because we opened with talking about what's life like in Washington and in the public policy arena and government relations as we're dealing with working from home and social distancing and all of the activities related to the coronavirus. But you just talked about how critical surveyors are. And I just want to point out that NSPS has been in a leadership in working with our state affiliates and in turn working with governors, because in most states, the general rule is that surveyors have been defined as essential and critical, and most surveyors are still working in large measure because of the initiative of NSPS. We've also been working with the Department of Homeland Security to make sure that their guidance on what is considered the critical infrastructure workforce of the nation, that's essential, that a lot of things related to surveying are in that document as a result of NSPS, again, working in coalition with others. So it's great that most surveyors are still working, and it is a demonstration of how critical and essential surveyors are to the economy and the quality of life in our country.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. That's certainly an important point. Well, thank you both for joining me today. And we'll be having more conversations, and maybe we'll want to do another one of these not too far out, JB, to make sure we keep everybody informed on all the other things that are going on. So it's been great talking to you guys today and actually seeing faces again instead of just looking at my computer screen or whatever during this difficult time. But hopefully sometime soon we'll be getting back to some semblance of normality and moving ahead. So, but we will keep our listeners and our members informed, and this is a good way to do it. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you, Curt. Stay safe, and hope all of the members of NSPS will stay safe.
Thank you, Curt.
Will do. Take care.
You've been listening to Point of Order here on the Surveyor Says podcast. We would like to thank our lobbyist, John J.B. Byrd, and legislative consultant, John Palatiello, for keeping NSPS in front of these items even during this historical period and lots of uncertainty ahead. Keep up to date with these issues and more within our weekly email newsletter, News and Views. More Table A Talk with Curt Sumner and Gary Kent are being scheduled, so send your questions for Gary to info@nsps.us.com and put Table A Talk in the subject line. Upcoming episodes include discussions with professionals nationwide on how surveying has continued during the pandemic, as well as a new series on insurance for the surveyor to limit liability. So, remember to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, as well as our podcast host, Podbean. And watch our website, nsps.us.com, for information on future episodes. And remember, it's a great day to be a surveyor.